Richard Wolff and Chris Hedges have a discussion about inflation. Let's go ahead and get into that.
Inflation at nearly 8%, along with soaring interest rates, massive personal debt, stagnant and in real terms declining wages are crippling the public. As inflation raises prices faster than wages, there is a continued redistribution of income and wealth upward from employees to employers, and more suffering for workers and their families. The Federal Reserve has reacted to inflation by quantitative tightening, reducing the quantity of money in circulation and raising interest rates. The Fed sells securities chiefly to major financial institutions, inducing them to buy by charging attractively low prices for those securities, as the economist Richard Wolff points out. These major financial institutions then pass on the higher rates, plus a markup for their own profits, to their customers, individuals, and businesses. In short, the major financial players profit from Fed policy while offloading its costs onto the smaller economic players they service with loans. The policy is based on the premise that costlier loans will dissuade borrowers who will then demand fewer goods and services and thereby induce sellers to inflate their prices less. The Fed's policy provides cash advantages to major employers, especially in financial enterprises and the rich. Higher interest costs are a heavier burden and a greater risk the smaller the size of a business or of an individual's wealth.
That goes back to the renting story we were talking about earlier tonight, in reference to people having to pay higher rent and rent increasing, right? So what the Fed is doing, first of all, is a stupid strategy, but what the Fed is doing by increasing the interest rates, the person who has the least amount of income, they're going to be affected by this the most.
Joining me to discuss inflation and the precarious state of our economy is Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University. He is the host of the weekly program Economic Update and the author of Capitalism Hits the Fan and Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, as well as the founder of Democracy at Work. His latest book is The Sickness in the System: When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. Rick, let's begin with inflation, which is, of course, worse in Europe. I think energy prices, energy costs went up by 80% in the UK in October. How did we get here before we talk about the response?
Now, do you guys see why people in the UK are on strike? You see why the railroad workers and the nurses and the postal mail carriers are also on strike? We talked about that the other night. That's crazy, right? They're hit the worst by it right now.
Yes, well, it's in a way the best question to ask, partly because it's how the inflation gets going that people are mostly interested in. It certainly should be part of understanding how to get a grip on it and to slow it or stop it. And finally, it is ignored as the obvious question by the media, which raises all the mass media, which raises all the questions why that might be the case. So let me answer. An inflation is a very simple idea. It's a word that refers to a general increase in prices. Not every price goes up. Prices of one thing go up more than another thing. But if in general the movement of prices is upward, and if it's more than the barely noticeable 1% or 1.5%, well, then we call it an inflation. And the current rate here in the United States, depending on how you count, 7.5 to 8 to 8.5%. And as you point out, higher in many parts of Europe, although it should be pointed out that both China and Japan have much, much lower rates of inflation, basically no inflation at all. So it is not, as the Biden folks like to say, a universal problem. It isn't.
Did you guys hear that piece right there? When I first watched this interview, I was like, okay, I have to play this for everybody. It is not a global problem. Japan and China are not having this issue. You guys see this? You hear it? Pass that on to your friends. Let them know about that. Anybody want to move to Japan? Who's coming with me?
Next point. Why doesn't inflation happen? Well, the answer here is so simple, you really have to wonder why it isn't spoken. Prices go up if the people who have the power to set prices raise them. That's it. No magic, no difficulty tracking through who does it. Employers do that. It's part of what it means to be an employer. The job description of the employer includes raising, lowering, or keeping the same what the price is. And what the employee's job description excludes is exactly the same thing. In other words, a tiny minority of the American people, the less than 1% who are employers, raise the prices. Otherwise, we don't have an inflation. So the first level of critical looking would have to be at the employer class, because they, not government officials, not the employees that are the vast majority, let alone those people at home and who are not working, it's the employers who made a decision, one after the other, to raise prices. They're the ones who give us, who impose on us, an inflation.
And they did so because they could. They did so because there's no one stopping them from doing it.
Now the third and final point, also missed by the mass media. It is, of course, reasonable to ask, why did the employers choose to raise prices about 18 months ago, and to do so further and faster and for a longer time than had been anticipated by the Federal Reserve, who we should remember formed and founded 100 years or so ago, had as its number one objective what is called maintaining price stability. Clearly, they failed, because an inflation means that's what we do not have. Okay, so what do the employers tell us?
This goes right back to the rent stability issue I was complaining about too. Like I told you, like once upon a time, this did exist here. Once upon a time, rent control did exist here. But someone along the way, and I'm going to have to look into this, someone along the way decided, we don't need to do that anymore here. We don't need to have that anymore in Boston. I want to know who made that decision. I'm going to have to look into that, because someone decided that. And you see how things just went crazy now. Now you have apartments that are like $4,000 a month. You see what happens when you don't have those types of regulations in place? People just go crazy.
Well, they could tell us what they learned in business school. Namely, every major decision you make should be guided by its impact on the bottom line, to wit, profits. Whether you hire someone, whether you expand your business, whether you borrow money, whether you issue shares of stock, whatever you do should be guided by whether it will enhance your profitability, in which case you should do it, or it will depress the profitability, in which case you should probably not do it unless there are extenuating circumstances. So the honest answer of an employer as to why he or she raises prices would have to be to make more profits. The problem is that when employers raise prices, it's a tiny minority financially hurting the majority. We all have to pay the higher prices that they determine to impose on us. That makes the employer prima facie an unhappy object of our, shall I say, irritation. So employers, which should surprise no one, have come up with a wonderful portfolio of scapegoats, things to say when you're trapped in the glare of publicity about raising prices, to exculpate yourself. So one employer will start telling you fantastic stories about quote unquote supply chain disruptions. a ship that got stuck somewhere, or maybe how the Chinese are coping with COVID-19, or maybe the one that I like best, I have to do it because other employers like me are doing it and I buy things from them. And so I have to pay them more. So one employer uses the behavior of the other employer to justify the total impact of all employers on the rest of us. We shouldn't believe what the employers say, given the obvious self-serving interest they have in removing themselves from the glare of publicity. Sadly, the media in our country, present company accepted, of course, but the media in our country overwhelmingly service the employer class by giving enormous attention to all the excuses they provide, minimal investigative scrutiny, and almost never pointing out to the American people that what you're grumbling about at the supermarket or the department store is the decision made by a tiny, unaccountable minority looking to make more profit.
Well said. Well said. That is actually what is happening here. And I think a big part too that he mentioned what mainstream media is ignoring. Mainstream media is not explaining it that way. They're mentioning all the excuses that he said. And it's sad because like most people watch mainstream media, not independent media. So most people are going to hear the narrative that's coming from MSM and they're going to believe that narrative, not realizing all the ins and outs. It's really just a simple response. Like the fact that they're doing so because they can, and there's nobody holding them accountable. There's nobody that's like basically slapping their hand and telling them, no, you can't do that. This is where you would think the president would step in, right? This is where you would think Joe Biden would step in and say, okay, that's it. You guys can't do this anymore. He said he would ask them. And I'm like, at this point, ask? What do you mean ask them? No, you tell them. You don't ask them. You tell them. Ay. Eric, if you still have that pyramid chart, I know you're probably like, I know she's not asking for this again. If you still have that pyramid chart, can you let me know? Because I want to show people, we have new people, and I want to show people where the president actually sits on that hierarchy chart.
Although the employers will argue with some justification that energy prices have risen and there have been disruptions to the supply chain, although not as extensive as they claim.
Yes, absolutely. There has to be always a grain of truth. Otherwise, the exaggeration you're making will be taken as a simple lie. So yes, try to anchor it to something. It would be more believable if we were in Europe, because for the Europeans, they are paying a very heavy price financially for the war in Ukraine. We are not. I mean, very important. We are leading the charge to impose the sanctions on Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine. We, the U.S., imposed with our allies in Europe, allies who are increasingly withdrawing from this arrangement, but nonetheless, they have gone along with it to impose sanctions on the exports of oil and gas from Russia. What they didn't seem to understand was that the Russians might very well be able to cope with these, which they have, and to come up with some counter sanctions of their own, which they...
Or they may have already had a plan or predicted that this was going to happen and they had already prepared for it. They really underestimated them. Or did they? I feel like they either really underestimated Russia, or maybe they didn't, but they just assumed that they would eventually cave and do the right thing. I don't know, but they really weren't prepared for this.
Also have. And the counter sanctions, together with the sanctions, have driven up the price of oil and gas, above all for Western Europe, which had come to rely on the gas from there, particularly the powerhouse economy at the core of Europe, which is Germany. So yes, you're right. Energy prices there have doubled, tripled. More horrible news of that kind is coming next month in December, when all kinds of further steps are going to go into effect. And so, yeah, in Europe for sure, their inflation is affected by corporations raising prices, but with the added boost, the added promotion, if you like, of the rising energy costs, and which are making, frankly, the Europeans, particularly the French, but also others, increasingly disaffected by the whole Ukraine situation. And that is going to become a major headache and headline in 2023.
Yes, that's the other piece too. It's so interesting because I mentioned that on RBN earlier too, was the oil, the energy crisis, and the fact that they don't know if they're going to have heat this winter, at least in the UK, according to what my friend told me. But this is just, it's absolutely crazy, you know. Maybe that's why they have thousands and thousands of people out in the streets. It's easier to get them to come out because they're like, this is ridiculous.
Well, the industrial sector in countries like Germany are suffering tremendously from this.
Tremendously. And if you put them together, and for me, this is the biggest story that is emerging. If you put together the discriminatory impact on Europe of the sanctions program and its impact on energy on the one hand, and the Biden administration following the Trump administration to, quote, bring jobs here to the United States, what many Americans don't seem to understand is that you may talk a lot about China, but the companies bringing production to the United States, because we subsidize them now on a scale we never did before, the latest microchip industry subsidies, even more so. You bring production here, it's coming increasingly from Germany, from France, from Italy, from Europe. You are, and this is a language they're speaking in Europe now, you are deindustrializing Europe. They are horrified. They are angry. In Paris, there's a school, been there for 25 years, but is becoming very important now. It's called the École de Guerre Économique. In English, the School for Economic Warfare. And
let me tell you something. If Germany is hurting, Germany at one point had a pretty good, pretty strong economy. If Germany is hurting right now, because that was like, you know, that's like my second home here. If Germany is hurting, they're really in trouble. They're really in trouble if they're hurting.
Their argument is the British Empire can no longer be the American agent in Europe. That role is now trying to be taken by Germany, leaving everybody else out. And the fracturing inside of Europe, it's held below the surface of publicity. But if you pay attention, it's everywhere and getting stronger literally by the day.
Well, and will be exacerbated, of course, over the winter. All sorts of restrictions on power usage, even showers, this kind of stuff.
The World Health Organization has given out, I believe it was today or yesterday, has given out a horrible picture of what Ukrainians are going to suffer because the electricity system has been a victim of the war to this point, and they rely on electricity for a lot of what their heating system is. It gets quite cold there, et cetera, et cetera. You're talking about a proliferation of really urgent crisis situations.
So let's talk about the Fed and the response of the Fed, which, in short, has inflicted even more pain on the American public.
Yep.
I am struck there, and here I just put on my hat as an economist. I'm struck by two things. Number one, the inflation has been going together with nice improvements in profitability across many, many sectors, not all, but many sectors of the United States. It gives a lot of evidentiary support to the notion that the inflation was done because it was the best profit-enhancing move after the pandemic had kind of eased off a little bit with us, etc. Number one. But I'm struck by the fact that no one is talking about what used to be a big topic, namely something we call stagflation. And let me remind everyone what that is. That's when the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, ostensibly to slow or stop an inflation, but fails to do so. So that we end up with rising interest rates, cutting down people's ability to spend, because they can't afford to borrow at those rates, but that the prices don't come down. So we have a mixture of inflation and stagnation in the sense of productivity and employment. And we even have a term because that has happened so often, stagflation, a new word in our lexicon. Well, you would think for people who have had some experience, which the Fed people by virtue of their age alone have had.
I can get down with that, D. Henry Miller. Let's all stop paying utility bills. That might be a plan. Seriously. I could get down with that.
That they would talk about that and give us some reason, any reason, to believe that we aren't at risk of having stagflation, namely higher interest rates with no amelioration of the inflation problem. There are plenty of specialists looking at this who believe precisely that's where we're headed. So it's not as though I'm the only one who remembers this term that we all learned in economics graduate school. But he's an even bigger issue. Raising interest rates never was and is not now the only way that the Federal Reserve or the US government has reacted to inflationary situations. In 1971, a conservative President Nixon imposed a wage price freeze to stop an inflation. It worked beautifully.
That's something, this is what I've said before, because I think we mentioned this one time before on the show about what Nixon did to freeze the prices. This is something that Joe Biden should be trying to do now. Like, it's just like, you know, like I'm not pro Nixon, but that makes sense that he did that. I mean, otherwise, like these companies are not going to stop raising the prices if you don't put your foot down. If you continue to let them keep doing it, they're going to keep doing it. They're getting richer and richer, and the rest of us are just, you know, pinching by, basically. Pinching by. Try with me if you want to. I know what it's like to make really low wages. I can stretch out a sandwich for a week. I'm serious. If it gets to the point where I'm not buying anything, I'm not buying anything if I can help it. I'm stocked up on most things anyway that I need on a monthly basis. But I'm just telling you, I just put the pedal to the gas, man. Not buying anything. I can get in my car and drive off. Seriously.
So well that its initial duration, 3 months, was extended because it had done the job without raising interest rates by this alternative. I am not saying that the alternative has no problems. It's not a panacea. But to exclude it from conversation, to exclude it from the agenda so that the Federal Reserve not only doesn't consider it, but doesn't even deign to give us a reason why is remarkable, and it should be alarming. Here's a second example, same point. In the early 1940s, then President, progressive Democrat, at least retrospectively, Franklin Roosevelt, is confronted by his economic advisors, who included one of my professors, John Kenneth Galbraith. He's confronted by them and told, look, you're moving resources to fight a war. Those resources used to be used to make consumer goods and all kinds of appliances, and we're not using them for that anymore. And therefore, we're going to have very quickly, here we go, a sudden shortage of consumer goods. The demand for them isn't going away. The American people want to have a cup of coffee. They want to put sugar in it. They want to have meat with their meals, et cetera, et cetera. And they're not going to have the supply. If we allow the market to deal with this situation, the shortage will give us an inflation. People with money will bid up the price of scarce consumer goods so that the middle income and lower income people will be frozen out of the market. And that, at a time when you're trying to fight a world war, you think puts you in danger, would be crazy. You'd be dividing your people with bitterness and envy when you need the exact opposite, solidarity and unity. And what did Roosevelt do? He took Galbraith and the others' advice seriously. And he said, okay, for the following important scarce consumer items, meat, sugar, flour, gasoline for your car, coffee, and a whole bunch of others, you won't use money anymore. It will not be sold to the highest bidder. The only way a storekeeper can legitimately sell any of those items is if you have a ration card. The government printed ration books. There were little stamps you tore out of the book, and to get a quart of milk, you had to give the storekeeper that stamp. If you only gave them money and they gave you the milk, they would be liable to arrest. That was illegal. They had to use the stamps. And the government, some of you may smile, distributed these books, these ration cards, ration stamps, according to the notion of what did you need. If you had a lot of young children, you got stamps for milk. If you were an elderly couple, you didn't get stamps for milk. If you were rural, you got more stamps for gasoline, to motorize, to move your truck. If you were urban and had mass transit, you wouldn't get them, etc. Logical things.
Okay, so how do we get these stamps back again? How do we get these stamps? I mean, it sounds like common sense to me. I don't hear anybody talking about, I don't hear Joe Biden talking about this. I don't hear his administration talking about this. This is why it's important that we know history. I didn't even remember learning about this in school. This is the first time I heard about these ration books when I saw this interview.
Rationing is an alternative. Wage price freezes are an alternative. That we as a nation have a Federal Reserve charged with dealing with price instability. That's their fault, since they're the ones supposed to keep it stable. That they would have a conversation whose real purpose is to make all of us not question which tool is being used according to who gets hurt and who gets benefited by it, but rather we're only left to debate, should it be 0.75%, 0.5%? My goodness, this is an exercise in censorship of the most damaging kind, because it immediately translates into damage to the standard of living of the American people.
All right, it's a long interview. You can see the rest of it on the Real News Network, and the name of this video is called "Inflation, Europe's Energy Crisis, and the Fed with Richard Wolff" for the Chris Hedges report. So check that out if you want to see the rest of it. I highly recommend watching the full interview. But we have to talk about these things. Let me know whenever you have that chart, Eric. We have to talk about these things because I really like listening about economics, because, and I don't think we should listen to it only when we have inflation, right? Like, I think we should be listening to this information on a regular basis so that we understand how the market and how things truly work. And so that way, when we hear those talking points from mainstream media, we can push back on that. You know, we have to educate ourselves. This is really important. Delthea said, my folks had some old ration books in the trunk at the foot of their bed. Wow. Yeah, this is the first time. But that's why I was like, I had never heard about that until I saw that interview. But as I was saying earlier, in reference to where the president actually sits, some of you may have seen this before. I've had it on the show multiple times, but I know there's some newbies in the chat as well. And you need to understand the difference between feudalism then and feudalism now. It's still the same, but the titles have changed. If we want to go back and we want to look at medieval feudalism, you would see at the top, you have the monarchs. Next, you would have landed gentry. Third, you would have the clergy. Fourth, the royal ministers. Fifth, the merchants. Sixth, vassals. And at the bottom is everyone else: peasants, laborers, conscripts, etc. Fast forward today, corporate feudalism. At the top, you have the central bankers. This is the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, ECB, etc. You have the big bankers, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Lloyd's, etc. Next, you have the corporate elite, the Fortune 500 multinationals. Right here, fourth, is where you have elected officials. That's the president, the MPs, the representatives. So if you pay close attention, This is what I've been trying to explain to people before. The president is not at the top. The president serves the oligarchs above him. Even the people who are Fortune 500, the corporate elite, they are still above the president of the United States. So as the president of the United States, it is pretty much their duty to protect these people, the bankers and the corporate elite. Below the elected officials, you have top bureaucrats. Now that includes commissioners, secretaries, judges. Then you have top professionals. That's doctors, entertainers, and clergy. And at the bottom, once again, you have everybody else, the workers, the students, the soldiers. These are a lot of the people that you see going on strike today, the people at the bottom. So the point that I want to drive home is this. Some of the people that you think have power or may have some type of power are not utilizing their power because of the people who are above them. And that would be the bankers, the banks, and of course, the corporate elite. And if we really want to get specific here, and we want to talk about someone being above the president, technically, we talked about Elon Musk at the beginning of the show. Elon Musk would be above the president. You guys see the difference? You see what I'm saying? Even someone like Elon Musk would be above the president because of his wealth and because of his status. He's the second richest person in the world. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So when I say that they serve and protect corporate interests, this is exactly what I mean. This is why we don't have Medicare for all. This is why they don't really want to cancel all of the student loan debt. And this is why they refuse, or the DNC will refuse, to let someone like Bernie Sanders actually win a fair shot. This is why they will come in and disrupt whatever campaign that they can so that they keep the status quo. Medieval feudalism, corporate feudalism. It hasn't really changed, just the titles. So there's that. And it says Sheldon Wolin calls it inverted totalitarianism. This is why. So these individuals right here at the bottom, they stay at the bottom. Most of them will stay at the bottom. Most of them don't make it to top professional. Most of them don't make it to top bureaucrats, and most don't make it to elected officials. Well, at least they're not the ones on the DC level. I'm not talking about local politicians. So these people at the bottom have to fight against all this. Now, that is not to discourage you. That is not to hurt your feelings. That is to show you the reality of the situation.